Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is the news brief. Well, this one is pretty special because in the past week, from the 3rd to the 7th, Ukraine has been thrown to the wolves by the United States. It is a pivotal week in changing the world as we know it. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And of course, as per usual, we're going to discuss it together in the comments so you don't have to suffer alone and I don't have to suffer alone. So leave your questions, suggestions, thoughts, constructive criticism, ideas, anything in your head down below because I love reading it and I really appreciate the conversation that we're having. Let's get it. First and foremost, I also want to say that if you're wondering why is she in her living room again, well, nope, not a ballistic missile this time. However, we do have some technical difficulties in our backup studio that we're using until we can come back to our permanent studio that was in fact ruined by a missile. So today I'm recording from home. So you get to witness my couch in my living room, which is also coincidentally a set of my personal new podcast that I'm going to use this opportunity to tell you about. It is a mix of politics, chit chat, personal feelings, and information about Ukraine. And you can find it on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube Music under Unmasking Pod. So check it out. So, the news has been so intense these past couple of weeks that I don't even have the time to properly think about it and analyze it before the next bombshell drops. Of course, we know that the United States completely stopped all support for Ukraine starting on the 3rd of March. Military support, that is. And of course, Donald Trump justified it as forcing Ukraine to the peace talks. However, today we also found out that, the United States is now stopping its intelligence sharing with Ukraine. And not only is the United States doing that, but they're also forcing Great Britain to do that. And they forbid Maxar satellite imagery to be given to Ukraine as well. And that includes both classified and unclassified information. You know who's not forbidden from accessing Maxar satellite imagery, though? Russia. So, is Donald Trump really trying to do that in the name of peace, or is he really trying to get Russia the victory that it so wants and force Ukraine into the capitulation? And force Ukraine into capitulation. It's a rhetorical question, really. What does make me feel a little better, though, is that Europe is definitely finally waking up. And I know we've said that so many times. They are definitely awoken because we have seen Macron's recent speech, and it is a very strong speech.
Go straight to the Elysee Palace from where Emmanuel Macron has been speaking. James Andre is our reporter there at the scene. James, good evening to you. This perhaps in many ways was expected, but nonetheless to hear those words as clearly as that, Europe has to unite, the United States pulling away, a different future lies ahead. The message from Macron, very clear.
Yeah, a very strong and clear message from Emmanuel Macron. Very clearly what he's trying to do here is mobilize the French, get them behind him in this new world we are indeed facing. The president said it quite clearly that, the recipes of the past cannot be applied to what is happening now. He did outline what the objectives of this summit that is going to take place, the European summit that's going to take place tomorrow, are going to be. He did explain that there were going to be new tools available, that indeed the deficit rules that had been in place in the European Union were going to be lifted for military spending, also saying that there would be unprecedented amounts of money injected into building a European defence. He also reminded everyone that it is something he's been asking and calling for over the past 8 years. For the people following French politics, this started in the Discours de la Sorbonne back in 2017, and it is something that's been constant in the president's message, that there is a need for independence and sovereignty when it comes to European defence. But also a message to the French people saying that, yes, it is in the sense of the end of an era, and that what is going to be required now from the French public is indeed a new mobilization in the face of a new threat, and a moment where indeed, the French public is called upon to, step up and indeed defend its values.
Indeed, James, one of the things that Macron did point out there is that there will be no tax rises. He was saying that the spending that is envisaged, and I think it's looking at the graph that he put up there during his speech, it's something like a 20 billion euro increase in spending from now until 2030 to back this remilitarization that he is launching right now. He was saying that would be private-public funding, no tax increases. Now, that is a big thing to say. I wonder how realistic that might be.
Well, look, I mean, these are going to be all the question marks that are now on the table. He said that indeed he didn't want tax raises, but he said there would be sacrifices and there would be decisions to be made. He also said that he wanted to see the country reindustrialize, and he said he wanted to see this reindustrialization to take place across all the regions of France. Basically, he said what we need is to have an integrated system where indeed there is European investment for European production, European products, and complete sovereignty when it comes to the complete chain, if you will, of production for these new military tools that are now required in the face of a renewed Russian threat. He actually outlined that threat, explaining that he said that Russia cannot be trusted at face value. There was this graph where he showed how Russian investment was on the rise, how many tanks, planes, men, indeed, Vladimir Putin's Russia was recruiting and producing at the time we are speaking, basically outlining the risk that stood before the European Union by 2030. So Emmanuel Macron very clearly restating France's position there and explaining that yes, France needs to step up, needs to defend Ukraine in order to put it in a position where there can be a peace deal and a solid peace deal. And he said not only for Ukraine and Europe, but he said even if this peace is achieved, yes, there will be sacrifice, investment, and there will be an effort from the French people, though he wants to do that without rising the taxes. And that, of course, is going to be a challenge.
However, I do really hope that that just keeps going and going and growing, and Europe doesn't turn out to wake up and then roll back over and fall back asleep, because that's what's been happening so far. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I think the easiest summary of everything that's going on is that the US has betrayed Ukraine and the entirety of the democratic world by siding with Russia. Europe is definitely developing a plan for victory, and Ukraine is Ukraine. We're strong, we're not going to give in, and the more the United States pushes us, the more we push back. And I think that's the mistake that Putin made, and I think this is the mistake that Trump is making as well. Underestimating the willpower and the ability and desire to fight back that Ukrainians have always had and continue exhibiting today. The next thing that we're anticipating is going to happen soon is going to be the United States turning off Starlink for Ukraine. Elon Musk has already toyed with the idea that he will only keep Starlink on if he can get in on the mineral deal with Ukraine, which is technically blackmail. Not technically. It's kind of like if you owned a business and a mafia head came to you and forced you to pay him for protection. That's basically what they're doing. But where I say that Europe is really stepping up, and it seems like they have finally awoken this time, is that a European company now came out and said that they are willing to free of charge substitute for the 40,000 terminals Ukraine has of Starlink to a different satellite internet dish in no time, or in the shortest amount of time possible. So that is the most positive direct action that we have seen from Europe in response to what's been happening in the United States. Another thing is that if you looked at the stock prices of Lockheed Martin, they are plummeting. They're tanking. That's the American weapons company, because a lot of their orders are being canceled. They're being canceled because Europe now understands that the United States is not an ally. United States is a threat to the world with the Trump administration, and the United States is a volatile, aggressive, unpredictable, and selfish nation that really doesn't want to help anyone but themselves. And you know what? That would be okay. But when the United States say, "What has Europe ever done for us?" Well, Article 5 on 9/11. A lot of European soldiers, with no hesitation, went and helped the United States on its mission. And actually, a lot of European soldiers died. And that was the one and only time that Article 5 was triggered. And now Trump says that he doesn't want Article 5 to exist in terms of the United States because he doesn't want to protect Europe. And he, again, is blackmailing Europe because he wants to install his rule of law and his order, which rule of law sounds funny from Donald Trump, in Europe. So they would do what he wants. Otherwise, he's not going to participate. And that's not how an alliance works. You do not dictate to other nations what they're supposed to do in order for you to participate in that alliance. That is a dictatorship. And this is how the United States is really, really turning away from all of its allies. You know, you're seeing that we're seeing that demonstrated very, very vividly in Canada. We're seeing that from speeches of Trudeau, and we're seeing that all over Canada, where there is graffiti popping up that there is no worse enemy than a friend who betrayed you, and a US flag next to it. And you know what? I think that actually summarizes exactly what the Trump admin is doing to the world, to its allies, to its neighbors, and to its friends that have been with the United States through and through.
I'd like to hear more about that phone call with the president yesterday. I wonder if you can describe the tone, the tenor, the scope. I understand some profanity emerged in that call. Maybe you can explain the context in which that happened. Can you give us some color on that phone?
I can confirm that it was a colorful call, and it was also a very substantive call. We talked about a range of issues. Of course, primarily the trade war that they have chosen to unjustly launch on Canada. But there is also a recognition that our two countries are deeply interwoven, not just in our economy, but in our people-to-people ties and our history. And we should be able to continue to do big things together as we have over many years in the past, first and foremost by negotiating and signing an extraordinarily successful USMCA CUSMA deal, but that there's more to do, and we committed to continue to work together constructively.
Certainly someone on the other side thought it important enough to note that profanity, that it was a heated exchange, to tell a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and we're in the business, we know these things don't get out there by accident. There was a purpose, I assume, that the American side had. So can we get a sense of where did it become heated? Is it he doesn't accept the facts of the case? Tell us what's going on here.
I'm not going to get into it in details, but there were different sections of the conversation in which different approaches and tones. But I've been having conversations and working with Donald for over 8 years now, and a lot of it is rolling with it. A lot of it is figuring out how to move forward constructively despite certain unpredictabilities that often come in, and remembering to stay steady no matter what. And that is the approach I've always taken. A firmness around standing up for Canadians, but an understanding that we can and should be working together to create benefits on both sides of the border, because that's how we benefit the most. Our two countries do best when we're working together, and that is what I will continue to advocate for.
And speaking of Article 5, not only is Donald Trump quite literally putting it out there into the public, and I mean officially, that he's not going to be protecting Europe and he's not going to be triggered in the Article 5, as in he's not going to comply. He's also saying his staffer, which is Kellogg, the special envoy to the war between Russia and Ukraine, and Pete Hegseth, literally saying that the Russia-Ukraine war is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a proxy war between Russia and the United States, directly repeating Russian propaganda from the Russian propaganda playbook. And you know, interestingly, because Trump says that, of course, he just wants peace, and he's doing this because Ukraine is not willing to negotiate, and he's just like, he wants peace, he wants to end the war. It's interesting that all of the consequences are being suffered by Ukraine, the body that has been invaded by Russia. Trump, from his administration, is parroting Russian propaganda every day now from the Oval Office. And there are senators on both sides calling him and his staffers out for it. And instead of giving direct responses, of course, they just swerve as usual and don't respond to the question. They just sort of talk about something else.
Senator, the president has made it absolutely clear that his top priority is to try to bring peace and end an absolutely savage war. I know you're familiar with the savagery. This is turning into World War I style trench warfare now in eastern Ukraine. The president is an exceptionally gifted deal maker. He is probably the only individual in the entire universe that could actually stop this. The president understands, as part of his deal
Well,
making,
let's turn to another of
that
the
you
folks
have to
here.
have carrots and
Thank you
sticks.
very much, since you're now off the topic I was raising. Mr. Whitaker, these 5 things that the president has done that are so favorable to Putin and so damaging to Ukraine and to our partnership with Europe, do you approve of them?
Well, Senator, thanks for that question. I'm just going to have to politely disagree with you on those 5 things and the way you've framed them. You know, the war in Ukraine would have never happened if President Trump was president in 2022. The war in Ukraine happened because of Joe Biden's weakness after his
I don't think
withdrawal
that was
from
the question I
Afghanistan.
asked, but maybe you could some other time go on television and express those points of view. But do you mind just answering the question I asked? Do you agree with the 5 things that President Trump has done, starting with him expressing Russian propaganda from the Oval Office?
Well, you know, again, as I mentioned to your colleague, I'm not here to assign labels. We're in the middle of a very important peace negotiation.
Okay,
I agree with
thank
Ambassador.
you. I do hope that we have an administration that works to get the very best deal for Ukraine, but what a Russian asset would do would be to work to get the very best deal for Russia, and that appears to be exactly what Donald Trump is trying to accomplish.
So we can no longer rely on the United States because they show in their actions that they're not looking for peace. They're looking for Russia's victory, and they're looking for full capitulation of Ukraine by cutting off our access to Starlink, cutting off our Maxar satellite imagery, even if we pay for it. Like, what's your deal then? If you want peace and you're trying to negotiate it, and you're like, okay, well, we're cutting off your weapons, then sure, Ukraine is like, well, okay, fine, we'll keep fighting. So how is it not forcing us into capitulation if you're literally taking away all of our ability to fight and taking away all of our ability to defend ourselves? This is forceful. This is not peace. This is forcing us into capitulation. And it's a signal to Putin that, you know what? Europe is open to aggression because the United States is not going to protect it. You can take over Ukraine because, you know, we're basically giving it to you. And Trump is not only flushing Ukraine down the drain, he's flushing the entirety of the Western world down the drain with it. He is breaking its ties with Canada, with the European Union, with absolutely everyone. And who does he seem to create ties with? Russia. And the interesting thing is, you know, Putin said this. He said this before Trump became president, that it's going to be Trump at the head of America like a king, and all of the European leaders dancing in front of him and kissing his shoes. And you know what? I think that's where he miscalculated as well, because the European leaders are not doing that. They're canceling their contracts with American defense companies. They're canceling their orders for American weapons. And you know who's going to be really not happy in lobbying and who has a lot of lobbying power in the United States? Defense manufacturers, because that's where most of America's GDP comes from. Yeah, Europe is fighting back. And Europe is talking back as well. And Europe is talking back stronger than ever. For instance, Macron in his historical, and I think that's going to be in the history books, in his historical speech on March 5th said this: "We need to prepare for the fact that the United States will not be on our side. Russia is planning to mobilize 3 million soldiers until by 2030 and 4,000 tanks. We need to support Ukraine on Ukraine's terms." And what France is also saying is that they might be willing to share their nuclear weapons with the rest of Europe. So they want to talk about nuclear weapons and their redistribution around Europe. Also, Macron talked about how Europe is no longer in peace mode. Europe now needs to be preparing for war in case it happens. And interesting shift of dynamic is that, you know, we're used to seeing Germany as the leader of the European Union, but I think France is taking that role, and is taking that role really rapidly with its very, very direct decisions. And not only that, but the UK is joining this initiative. And I think that France and the UK are two powerhouses in Europe at the moment with their decision making and with how fast they're reacting to all of these events. And you might say, well, Europe says a lot, but then they never really do anything. So what makes you think this time is different? Well, because this time Europe didn't just say things, they actually proved their intentions the very next day at a security conference for the European security. They have voted, including Hungary and Slovakia, who I think at this point are realizing that Putin is not a friend. He's just using them, and he's going to flush them as easily as Trump flushed Ukraine and Europe, because they know that this is all coming from Putin, so they know exactly who's pulling the strings. But I digress. The European Union decided to invest $800 billion into European security, and as I said, Orban and Fico supported it.
Well, meanwhile, the European Union Commission chief has presented a plan to mobilise 800 billion euros for European defence. Let's hear what Ursula von der Leyen had to say.
Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. Rearm Europe could mobilize close to 800 billion euros of defense expenditures for a safe and resilient Europe. We will, of course, continue working closely with our partners in NATO. This is a moment for Europe, and we are ready to step up.
Ursula von der Leyen there. Well, earlier I spoke to our correspondent Dave Keating in Brussels, and he explained exactly what the move means.
This plan is called Rearm Europe, and it has 5 actions. The first would be this long talked about suspension of EU deficit rules that would allow national governments to invest in defense in a way that would ordinarily exceed those rules and spark an excessive deficit procedure. The proposal now is to drop that if the spending is for defense. Ursula von der Leyen said just now that that alone would mobilize 650 billion euros if each EU member state increased its defense spending by 1.5% over the next 4 years. Then the second action is spending together joint procurement to buy military equipment to lower the cost and enable countries to spend more strategically in a more coordinated way. Third is using the EU budget, specifically through cohesion funds. So those are funds normally meant to bring poorer EU areas up to the standards of richer EU areas. That money could instead be spent on defense. And then the fourth and fifth actions have to do with mobilizing private financing, first through the European Savings and Investment Union, and secondly through the European Investment Bank. There are problems with both of that they've encountered because in the European Investment Bank's charter, it specifically says they can't invest in military equipment, so they have to find some way to change that. Now, I should say all of this is long-term changes, and so actually what the Kremlin just said there in the statement isn't quite accurate. Certainly, I think this announcement has been triggered by that announcement overnight. This was a kind of last-minute thing. You could tell from the urgency with which von der Leyen was speaking. However, the short-term measure, which was supposed to be adopted at Thursday's Emergency European Council here in Brussels, which is an immediate 20 billion euros over to Ukraine, has been vetoed by Viktor Orban. It's been removed from the Council conclusions. So all of this, while certainly would be welcome to those who have been calling for more European defense spending, more European sovereignty, it's all long-term. The short-term measure is, as of now, we're hearing off the table.
Then, as I mentioned prior, the French company Eutelsat, but I'm sure I'm pronouncing this wrong. It's probably something like Eutelsat, is the one who is going to be providing 40,000 terminals to Ukraine if Ukraine chooses to accept the offer, but they're ready. 800 billion euro is a challenge. And it's a challenge not for Europe, it's a challenge to Putin. This means that Europe is entering full defense mode for war. This is war prep. No one decides to invest this much money in defense if they're not looking at the very real, very, very imminent possibility of danger and war. And now Europe is focusing on itself. They're not looking at the US. Macron said very, very vividly, the US is not an ally. Russia is an aggressor, and Russia is danger. And Europe needs and has to become self-sufficient. And we're really seeing this happen, not just be said. It's a big deal. What Eutelsat, or Eutelsat in my, pardon my American, uh, is doing is it's giving Ukraine a lifeboat for Starlink terminals, because without internet on the front lines, there is not going to be any communication. Like, while we can survive without satellite imagery and we can find workarounds, and while we can survive without weapons and we can develop our own and find workarounds, of course we're going to take, a lot of losses, but we can figure it out. Being without internet and that infrastructure that has been built up for years is crucial, because there is no communication, and communication is crucial for warfare. So this is a really, really big lifeboat, and it's also a very big signal both to America and to Russia. Europe is not abandoning Ukraine. Europe stands with Ukraine. They're also showing Trump that they're not going to be dancing to his music at his whim, that they are self sufficient and they can make their own decisions and he can't dictate them. And they're showing Putin that they know what's happening and they're not buying it and they're not submitting to it. And that is the biggest deal out of all of it. But what do pro Russian politicians think about it? Because, of course, they have a lot to think and a lot to share. Unfortunately, I wish they would just keep it to themselves. Though, in this particular case, and shit has hit the fan when pro Russian political parties in Europe are starting to side with the adequate, normal, reasonable parties, right? And the first sign of that is France. Marine Le Pen, the far right leader of France, who has been on trial for taking money for her campaign from Putin, essentially, in layman's terms, and has supported Russia through and through, is supporting Macron and his initiative for Europe's defense, and she's supporting him in all of his decisions about Ukraine, which is just, I would say it's wild, but I think that should signify to you exactly how bad things are and exactly how destructive the US is to the rest of the world, and how much of an issue the rest of the world is perceiving it as, and how much Trump is screwing up all of US alliances. Marine Le Pen has quite literally condemned the US, despite her love for Putin. So, even she understands that the US flushed Ukraine so cynically that this could happen to anyone. And I think even she now understands that Putin will do the same once there's no use for her or for France for him. And that's a key moment. Trump and Putin miscalculated. They miscalculated Europe. Putin said, as I mentioned earlier, that everybody is going to be dancing to Trump's music and everybody in Europe is just going to be bowing down to him. Well, that didn't happen. Europe decided no thanks. Trump miscalculated how much of a king he is and how much everybody is subservient to the US. He thought because of the US weapons, he can manipulate everyone else. He thought because Europe is going to understand the threat, they're going to need the US to survive. But what Europe did instead, Europe was like, well, what makes the US a superpower is that we actually buy weapons from you and we pay for them. Therefore, giving you the ability to produce so much weapons, to innovate so much weapons, and to keep us in a chokehold. So you know what? Let's cancel these contracts and see how you feel. Because the US is only a superpower with friends. The US is only a superpower when it has strong alliances and when it has strong support. The US is no longer a superpower when it's breaking all of its relationships, when its stock market is tanking and when its GDP is tanking and when everybody's turning away from it. The US currently has such limited intelligence sharing because most countries are not willing to supply intelligence to Tulsi Gabbard, who is now the head of the CIA. So the interesting thing that Trump didn't calculate, because he's not as smart as he wants you to think he is that you can't climb to the top without anybody supporting you at the bottom. And I think the US is going to find out what it's like to hit a rock bottom. Oh, and by the way, in 2012, Trump said that any president who would let the Dow of the stock market to hit a negative 1,000 points needs to be impeached immediately. Well, within 2 days, the stock market under Trump went under 1,100 plus points. So, pronto, please? Europe's actions are breaking the US and Russia's calculations. Ukrainian bravery and ability and willingness to stand its ground is also doing that. And it, as per usual, always falls on the will of Ukrainians, and we have the will. Trump is trying to negotiate with corpses of Ukrainian politicians that everybody hates to put them into power in Ukraine. Let that sink in. Trump says that Zelensky is a dictator, and he wants to put people in power in Ukraine who are going to be willing to accept terms that Zelensky is not going to. So, in other words and in layman's terms, he wants to put puppets in power that are going to be bowing down to him. That's not democratic, because that's not what the Ukrainian people want. He calls Zelensky a dictator, even though he represents exactly what we want. And he wants to put in power politicians that we absolutely hate and would never vote for, so they would agree with him. That's who Trump is. And that's what Trump is trying to do to Ukraine, is trying to do to Europe, and is trying to do to everyone. But we're not going to give up. And we now see that Europe has our back, and we are going to get stronger together. And the country that's going to come out of this in an absolute loss is the US. And it's going to take it a very, very long time to recover from the absolute destruction of its image on the world stage and trust to it. And it's going to take US, I don't even know how long, to recover from the absolute destruction of its image and trust on the world stage, because it has just declared itself an enemy of the democracies. Not a friend, not an ally, not a neutral, an enemy. This is a war for survival, and Ukrainians are really proving that we're not broken as easily. It's not as easy to break us. I'm not going to call us unbreakable or resilient, because, I'm so tired of these terms. But we're not going to be broken by some orange dictator who wants to bury us. No way. This gives Europe time and inspiration to actually do the same. And it's so good to see. I want to thank you. I want to thank every American that supports us, and I want to thank all of Europe for supporting us. But I also do want to say this to Americans. When you say, I support you, but you continuously keep letting your politicians do what they do, your words contradict your actions. You're in a situation where law and the legal process flies out of the window. And I see that a lot of Americans rely on the legal process. But you can't rely on the legal process to take down a tyrant. If you want to take him down, and I'm not saying you should, it's up to you, but if you want to take Trump down, legal processes are not going to help you. That's not how it works with a hostile government takeover. And your window of opportunity for a revolution is this small. You're already late to class, but the door hasn't locked yet. You still have the opportunity to do something. So please do it if you feel like that's something that needs to happen. And in the meanwhile, that's all I have for you for today. I'm sorry for a quick analysis, but we're trying to do what we can with the circumstances we're in. And of course, if you enjoyed this type of conversation and you would like to hear more like that, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on your notifications. Also, send this video to a friend and everybody you know so they're also aware of the situation. Like it. And of course, leave me your thoughts, questions, suggestions. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts on what's happening? How can Americans save themselves from Trump? If you're American, what do you think are the challenges from taking back the democracy? And of course, I read everything that you leave for me because I appreciate it very much. And I enjoy having a conversation with you. See you next time.